The revelation came in the most unexpected place, standing in the lobby of what many considered the most successful church in America. Crossroads Community Church boasted 15,000 members across 3 campuses, a $50 million facility with state-of-the-art technology, and a pastoral staff that included some of the most recognizable names in modern Christianity. Their worship services were broadcast to millions, their small group programs were copied by churches worldwide, and their community outreach programs had transformed entire neighborhoods. I had been invited to speak at their annual leadership conference, an honor that represented the pinnacle of recognition in evangelical circles. As I stood in their marble-floored lobby, surrounded by flat-screen displays showcasing their ministries and a coffee bar that rivaled any upscale cafe, I couldn't help but feel impressed by what human dedication and divine blessing could accomplish together. Pastor Michael Richardson, the church's founding pastor, gave me a personal tour before the evening service. We walked through children's areas that looked like theme parks, youth facilities that resembled entertainment complexes, and a main sanctuary that could house a small concert venue. Every detail spoke of excellence, every program demonstrated innovation, and every statistic reflected remarkable growth and impact. God has blessed us beyond our wildest dreams, Pastor Richardson said as we concluded the tour in his office, which overlooked the sprawling campus through floor-to-ceiling windows. 25 years ago, we started with 12 people in my living room. Now we're reaching thousands every week, baptizing hundreds every year, and sending missionaries around the world. I truly believe we're seeing the New Testament church in action. That evening, I watched from the platform as 8,000 people filled the sanctuary for their Saturday night service. The worship was professionally produced, the technology was flawless, and the congregation was genuinely engaged. Pastor Richardson delivered a polished message about God's faithfulness that was both biblically sound and practically relevant. The service concluded with dozens of people responding to an altar call for salvation. By every measurable standard, Crossroads Community Church was a phenomenal success. They were reaching the lost, discipling believers, serving their community, and expanding God's kingdom. They represented everything that church growth experts taught and everything that denominational leaders celebrated. So, why did I feel such a profound uneasiness as I left the service that night? The feeling intensified over the following weeks as I reflected on my experience at Crossroads. Despite all their obvious success, something had felt missing, not in their programs or their preaching, but in something deeper and more fundamental. I couldn't articulate what it was, but the uneasiness wouldn't leave me. 3 months later, I received a phone call that began to clarify my concerns. It was from Jennifer Walsh, a former staff member at Crossroads who had recently resigned from her position as small groups pastor after 8 years of ministry there. "Jonathan," she said, her voice carrying a mixture of sadness and relief, "I need to tell you something about what's really happening in churches like Crossroads. And I think you're one of the few people who might understand. We've built something incredible, but I'm not sure it's what Jesus actually wants." Over the next hour, Jennifer shared observations that shattered my comfortable assumptions about modern church success. Despite all their growth in programs, she had watched spiritual maturity actually decline among long-term members. Despite their emphasis on community, she had seen increasing isolation and superficial relationships. Despite their focus on reaching the lost, she had observed a subtle but persistent drift away from the radical demands of the gospel. "We've become experts at attracting crowds," she explained, "but we've forgotten how to make disciples. We've mastered the art of creating religious experiences, but we've lost the ability to facilitate genuine spiritual transformation. We've built a machine that produces impressive statistics while producing fewer and fewer people who actually look like Jesus." Jennifer's observations haunted me because they echoed concerns I had been sensing in churches across the country. Everywhere I spoke, I encountered the same pattern: impressive growth, innovative programs, and enthusiastic congregations, but a troubling absence of the kind of radical discipleship that characterized the early church. "The most disturbing part," Jennifer continued, "is that we've become so focused on what works that we've stopped asking whether what works is what Jesus actually wants. We measure success by attendance, giving, and program participation, but we don't measure whether people are actually becoming more like Christ." After that conversation, I found myself paying closer attention to the churches I visited. What I discovered was both impressive and deeply troubling. Modern evangelical churches had become incredibly sophisticated at creating religious experiences, building community programs, and managing organizational growth. But they seemed to be producing fewer and fewer believers who demonstrated the radical love, sacrificial service, and countercultural values that Jesus had taught. 6 months after my visit to Crossroads, as I was preparing for another speaking engagement about the state of the American church, I found myself desperately needing answers that went beyond church growth strategies and ministry innovations. The questions Jennifer had raised demanded responses that I couldn't find in any leadership book or seminary course. That night, alone in my study, I found myself on my knees in prayer with an urgency I hadn't felt since my encounters with Jesus about marriage and divine judgment. Lord, I whispered, I'm seeing something in modern churches that troubles me deeply, but I can't articulate what it is. I need to know what you really think about what we've built in your name. I need to understand whether our success is actually success in your eyes. The study grew quiet in that familiar way that preceded Jesus' appearances. But this time, instead of his immediate presence, I felt compelled to think about the difference between the churches described in the New Testament and the churches I had been visiting across America. The contrast was staggering. The early church had no buildings, no professional staff, no sophisticated programs, and no marketing strategies. Yet they had turned the world upside down through the radical transformation of ordinary people who had encountered the living Christ. Modern churches had everything the early church lacked, but seemed to lack everything the early church had. Suddenly, my study filled with that familiar presence, and Jesus was sitting in the chair across from my desk. But his expression was unlike anything I had ever seen before, not angry or condemning, but filled with a deep sorrow that seemed to encompass centuries of good intentions that had somehow missed the mark. Jonathan, he said, his voice carrying both infinite love and profound grief, you've identified the tragedy of the modern church. They have succeeded at everything except the one thing that matters most. Tonight, I'm going to show you what I really think about what has been built in my name and why so much religious success has produced so little spiritual transformation. Before I could respond, my study around us dissolved. We were observing what appeared to be the most comprehensive view of modern Christianity I had ever witnessed, not just individual churches, but the entire landscape of contemporary evangelical culture. What you're about to see, Jesus explained, will stun you not because it reveals how bad the modern church is, but because it reveals how far they've drifted from what I actually intended while believing they were serving me faithfully. The vision that unfolded before me was both heartbreaking and illuminating. I saw thousands of churches across America, each one filled with sincere believers, dedicated pastors, and impressive ministries. But I also saw something that explained the uneasiness I had felt at Crossroads and countless other churches. The stunning truth, Jesus said, is not that the modern church has rejected me, it's that they've replaced me with something that looks like me, but lacks my actual presence and power. They've created a version of Christianity that's more comfortable, more manageable, and more successful than what I actually taught, but it's not what I died to establish. I watched as this pattern played out in church after church. Congregations that had learned to worship without encountering the living God. Believers who had mastered Christian behavior without experiencing spiritual transformation. Leaders who had built impressive ministries without developing intimate relationships with Christ. They preach about me, Jesus continued, but they don't know me. They serve in my name, but they don't follow my example. They've created religious institutions that honor me in theory while ignoring me in practice. The vision expanded to show me how this had happened gradually, through thousands of small compromises that seemed wise and necessary at the time. Churches had adapted their message to avoid offending seekers, modified their demands to retain members, and adjusted their methods to compete with entertainment culture. Each compromise seemed reasonable, Jesus explained, but together they've created something that bears my name while lacking my nature. They've built successful religious organizations while losing the radical, transformational community I intended the church to be. As the vision continued, I began to see the specific ways that modern churches had drifted from Jesus' original design. They had replaced his call to radical discipleship with comfortable church membership. They had substituted religious programs for genuine spiritual community. They had exchanged the costly grace of transformation for the cheap grace of acceptance without change. The most stunning aspect, Jesus said, is that they've done this while genuinely believing they were serving me faithfully. They've measured their success by standards that have nothing to do with what I actually value, and they've celebrated achievements that I find heartbreaking. I thought of Pastor Richardson's pride in Crossroads' growth and impact, and suddenly I understood the tragedy Jesus was revealing. The modern church had become incredibly successful at everything except producing the kind of radical disciples that Jesus had actually called them to make. But Lord, I asked, my heart racing as I considered the implications, if churches like Crossroads are missing the mark so completely, what do you actually want from your church? What would a church that truly pleased you actually look like? That's what I'll show you tomorrow night. Jesus replied, his expression mixing infinite compassion with holy determination. Meet me where you first understood the difference between religious activity and spiritual reality. There I will reveal what I actually intended the church to be, and why that vision is so different from what has been built in my name. As his presence began to fade, his final words burned themselves into my consciousness. Tell them that their success is not my success. Tell them that their growth is not my glory. Tell them that I'm not impressed by what impresses them, and I'm not satisfied by what satisfies them. And then I was alone in my study, but everything had changed. The comfortable assumptions about modern church success lay in ruins around me. According to Jesus, the very things that contemporary Christianity celebrated as evidence of God's blessing were actually evidence of how far the church had drifted from his original design. Crossroads Community Church wasn't an exception, it was the norm. Churches across America had become incredibly sophisticated at creating religious experiences while losing the ability to facilitate genuine spiritual transformation. They had mastered the art of attracting crowds while forgetting how to make disciples. But Jesus' revelation had raised even more disturbing questions. If the modern church had drifted so far from his original intention while believing they were serving him faithfully, what did he actually want from his people? What would a church that truly pleased him actually look like? And most importantly, was it possible to return to his original design without abandoning everything that had been built in his name? The second night brought revelations that shattered every assumption I had about what constituted successful Christianity. After Jesus revealed that modern churches had replaced him with something that looked like him but lacked his actual presence and power, I couldn't stop thinking about how far contemporary Christianity had drifted from his original design. As instructed, I drove to a small, abandoned church building on the outskirts of town where I had once experienced the most profound encounter with the presence of God in my life. The building had been empty for years, its congregation having moved to a larger, more modern facility across town. But it was in this simple, unadorned sanctuary that I had first understood the difference between religious activity and spiritual reality. The old church was exactly as I remembered it. Wooden pews worn smooth by decades of use, plain glass windows that let in the moonlight, and a simple wooden cross hanging behind a modest pulpit. There was nothing impressive about the building, nothing that would attract crowds or compete with modern entertainment. Yet it was here that I had encountered the living Christ in a way that had transformed my understanding of what church was supposed to be. As I settled into the same pew where that encounter had occurred years earlier, I felt the familiar deepening of reality that preceded Jesus' appearances. The sanctuary seemed to pulse with a presence that had nothing to do with programs, technology, or professional ministry, and then Jesus was standing behind the simple pulpit, his presence both utterly humble and completely sovereign. This is where you first understood that my presence has nothing to do with impressive buildings or sophisticated programs, he said, his voice echoing softly in the sacred space. Tonight, I'm going to show you what I actually intended the church to be, and why that vision is so different from what has been built in my name. Before I could respond, the abandoned church around us dissolved. We were observing what appeared to be the most comprehensive comparison I had ever witnessed the church, as Jesus had originally designed it, contrasted with what it had become in modern America. The stunning truth, Jesus explained, is not just that the modern church has drifted from my original design, it's that they've created something I never intended and would never have established. They've built religious institutions that serve human needs while ignoring my actual purposes. What I witnessed next revolutionized my understanding of what Jesus had actually intended when he said he would build the church. The vision showed me that there were fundamental differences between his original design and what contemporary Christianity had become. When I said I would build my church, Jesus explained, I wasn't talking about creating religious organizations that would compete for members, construct impressive buildings, and develop entertaining programs. I was talking about establishing communities of radically transformed people who would demonstrate my kingdom through their love for each other and their service to the world. I watched as this original vision played out in the early church. Small groups of believers who met in homes, shared their possessions, cared for each other's needs, and turned their communities upside down through the radical love they demonstrated. They had no professional clergy, no church buildings, no sophisticated programs, yet they changed the world through the power of authentic spiritual community. This early church, Jesus said, wasn't successful because of what they had, it was powerful because of what they were. They weren't trying to attract crowds or build institutions. They were living as my body in the world, demonstrating my love through their relationships with each other. The vision shifted to show me how this had gradually changed over the centuries. Well-meaning believers had begun to institutionalize what had been organic, professionalize what had been relational, and organize what had been spiritual. Each change seemed reasonable and necessary, but together they had created something entirely different from what Jesus had originally established. The modern church, Jesus explained, has become focused on doing religious activities rather than being my people. They've replaced authentic community with church membership, genuine discipleship with program attendance, and spiritual transformation with religious education. I watched as this pattern played out in church after church across America. Congregations that had learned to measure success by attendance figures rather than spiritual maturity, by building projects rather than character development, by program participation rather than life transformation. They've created what I call consumer Christianity, Jesus continued, where people come to church to receive religious services rather than to be equipped for radical discipleship. They've turned my church into a religious business that competes for customers rather than a spiritual family that transforms lives. The comparison was devastating. The early church had been characterized by sacrificial love, radical generosity, and countercultural values that challenged the surrounding society. Modern churches were characterized by comfortable worship services, convenient programs, and cultural accommodation that rarely challenged anyone. The early believers, Jesus explained, were known for how they loved each other, how they cared for the poor, and how they were willing to suffer for their faith. Modern believers are known for their church buildings, their worship music, and their political opinions. I began to see that the problem wasn't just about methods or styles, it was about fundamental purposes. The early church existed to demonstrate God's kingdom through transformed lives and radical love. Modern churches existed to provide religious services and maintain institutional success. The stunning truth, Jesus said, is that the modern church has become everything I never intended it to be. Instead of communities of radical disciples, they've become religious social clubs. Instead of training centers for kingdom living, they've become entertainment venues for spiritual consumers. The vision expanded to show me how this affected individual believers. In the early church, every member was expected to be a minister, every believer was trained for service, and every person was held accountable for spiritual growth. In modern churches, most members were passive consumers who attended services but weren't equipped for ministry or challenged toward maturity. They've created a clergy-laity divide, Jesus explained, that I never established. They've made church something people attend rather than something they are. They've turned my body into an audience and my family into a customer base. What struck me most was that this wasn't happening in liberal churches that had abandoned biblical truth. It was happening in evangelical churches that claimed to follow Scripture faithfully. They had maintained orthodox theology while losing authentic spirituality. The most stunning aspect, Jesus continued, is that they've done this while using my name and claiming my authority. They've built religious empires that serve human ambitions while believing they're advancing my kingdom. I thought of Pastor Richardson and Crossroads Community Church, and suddenly I understood the tragedy more clearly. They weren't intentionally rebelling against Jesus, they were sincerely trying to serve him. But they had been shaped by cultural expectations and institutional pressures that had led them far from his original design. But how did this happen? I asked, my heart breaking as I considered the implications. How did sincere believers who wanted to serve you end up creating something so different from what you intended. The drift happened gradually, Jesus replied, through thousands of small compromises that seemed wise at the time. They adapted my message to avoid offending people, modified my demands to retain members, and adjusted my methods to compete with entertainment culture. The vision shifted to show me how each compromise had led to the next. Churches that softened the call to discipleship to attract more attendees. Leaders who focused on numerical growth rather than spiritual maturity. Congregations that prioritized comfort over transformation. They began measuring success by worldly standards, Jesus explained, rather than by my standards. They celebrated what impressed people rather than what pleased me. They built what worked rather than what I wanted. I watched as this pattern had accelerated in recent decades with the rise of church growth movements, seeker-sensitive strategies, and entertainment-based worship. Each innovation had been designed to make church more attractive and accessible, but together they had created something that bore little resemblance to what Jesus had originally established. The result, Jesus said, is religious institutions that are incredibly successful at everything except the one thing I actually called them to do, make disciples who live like me and love like me. As the vision continued, I could see how this affected not just individual churches but entire denominations and movements. Christianity in America had become a religious industry focused on growth, success, and influence, rather than a spiritual movement focused on transformation, service, and sacrifice. They've created a version of Christianity, Jesus explained, that's more comfortable than what I taught, more manageable than what I modeled, and more successful than what I established. But it's not what I died to create. The implications were staggering. If Jesus was right, then the very things that contemporary Christianity celebrated as evidence of God's blessing were actually evidence of how far the church had drifted from his original purpose. But Lord, I asked, my voice trembling with the weight of what he was revealing, if the modern church has become something you never intended, what hope is there? Can it be reformed, or does it need to be completely rebuilt? That's what I'll show you tomorrow night, Jesus replied, his expression mixing holy grief with divine hope. Meet me where you first understood that I'm not interested in reforming religious institutions, I'm interested in transforming human hearts. There I will reveal what it would take to return to my original design, and whether that's even possible within the structures that have been built. As his presence began to fade, his final words burned themselves into my consciousness. Tell them that I'm not impressed by their success. I'm grieved by their failure to be what I called them to be. Tell them that their growth is not my glory, their buildings are not my body, and their programs are not my presence. And then I was alone in the abandoned church, but everything had changed. The comfortable assumptions about modern Christianity lay in ruins around me. According to Jesus, the contemporary church hadn't just drifted from his original design, they had created something he never intended and would never have established. The stunning truth wasn't that modern churches were failing by their own standards. Many were incredibly successful. The stunning truth was that their standards had nothing to do with what Jesus actually valued. They had built religious institutions that served human needs while ignoring his actual purposes. But this revelation raised the most important question of all. If the modern church had become something Jesus never intended, what would it take to return to his original design? Was reformation possible, or would it require something far more radical than anyone was prepared to consider? The third night brought the most hopeful yet challenging revelation about the future of Christianity I had ever received. Jesus had shown me that modern churches had become something he never intended, but now I needed to understand what he was actually doing in response to this drift and what role his people could play in returning to his original design. As instructed, I drove to a small house church that met in the living room of Tom and Maria Santos, a couple who had left their megachurch 3 years earlier to pursue what they called authentic Christian community. It was there that I had first witnessed believers attempting to return to the New Testament model of church life, sharing meals, studying scripture together, caring for each other's practical needs, and making decisions through prayer and consensus rather than professional leadership. The Santos home was modest and unremarkable, with worn furniture arranged in a circle around their living room and a simple wooden cross hanging on the wall. There was nothing impressive about the setting, nothing that would attract crowds or compete with modern church facilities. Yet it was here that I had encountered some of the most genuine Christian fellowship and authentic spiritual growth I had seen in years. As I settled into the same chair where I had participated in their weekly gathering, I felt the familiar thickening of the atmosphere that preceded Jesus' appearances. The living room seemed to glow with a presence that had nothing to do with professional ministry or sophisticated programs, and then Jesus was sitting in the center of the circle, his presence both utterly accessible and completely transforming. "This is where you first saw believers attempting to return to my original design for the church," he said, his voice filling the simple room with gentle authority. "Tonight I'm going to show you what I'm actually building in response to the drift of modern Christianity, and what it will take for my people to participate in this new work." Before I could respond, the Santos living room around us dissolved. We were observing what appeared to be the most hopeful vision I had ever witnessed, not the church as it currently existed, but the church as Jesus was actively building it in response to the failures of modern Christianity. "The hopeful truth," Jesus explained, "is that while religious institutions have drifted from my original design, I have never stopped building my true church. Even now, I'm raising up communities of believers who are returning to authentic discipleship, genuine community, and radical love." What I witnessed next filled me with both excitement and trepidation. Across the country and around the world, Jesus was showing me small groups of believers who were abandoning the comfort and convenience of consumer Christianity to pursue the costly but transformational life of genuine discipleship. "These believers," Jesus said, "are not trying to reform existing religious institutions. They're allowing me to build something new through them. They're discovering that my church was never meant to be an institution people attend, but a community they become part of." I watched as this new movement played out in countless variations. House churches like the Santos Gathering, but also intentional Christian communities, missional neighborhoods, and workplace ministries, where believers were learning to live as my body in the world, rather than just attending religious services. "What makes these communities different," Jesus explained, "is not their size or their methods, but their purpose. They exist to be transformed by me and to demonstrate my kingdom through their love for each other and their service to the world." The contrast with modern megachurches was striking. These communities measured success not by attendance figures but by spiritual maturity, not by building projects but by character development, not by program participation but by life transformation. "They've rediscovered," Jesus continued, "that the church is not a place you go but a people you become part of. They're learning to share their lives with each other, not just their Sunday mornings." I watched as believers in these communities practiced the kind of radical love and mutual care that had characterized the early church. They shared their resources with those in need, made major life decisions in consultation with their spiritual family, and held each other accountable for spiritual growth in ways that went far beyond what modern churches typically expected. "This is what I meant," Jesus explained, "when I said I would build my church, not religious institutions that compete for members, but spiritual communities that transform lives through authentic relationships and radical love." But what struck me most was that these communities weren't perfect or problem-free. They struggled with conflicts, made mistakes, and faced challenges that modern churches avoided through professional management and institutional structures. "The difference," Jesus said, "is that they're learning to work through their problems as a spiritual family rather than avoiding them as religious consumers. Their conflicts become opportunities for growth rather than reasons to leave." The vision expanded to show me how these authentic Christian communities were affecting their surrounding neighborhoods and workplaces. Instead of trying to attract people to church services, they were demonstrating the love of Christ through their daily lives and relationships. "They're discovering," Jesus explained, "that evangelism is not about getting people to attend religious services, but about demonstrating my love in ways that make people hungry for the transformation they see in my followers." I watched as non-believers were drawn to these communities not by impressive programs or entertaining services, but by the authentic love, genuine community, and radical generosity they witnessed in the lives of believers. "This is how the early church grew," Jesus said, "not through marketing strategies or seeker-sensitive services, but through the attractive power of transformed lives living in authentic community. But as the vision continued, I began to see the challenges these communities faced. They were often criticized by traditional churches for being too small, too informal, or too demanding. They struggled with leadership development, financial sustainability, and the practical difficulties of making decisions through consensus rather than professional management. The cost of authentic community, Jesus explained, is much higher than the cost of religious attendance. It requires believers to share their lives with each other, not just their Sunday mornings. It demands vulnerability, accountability, and mutual submission that most Christians have never experienced. I began to understand why so few believers were willing to leave the comfort and convenience of consumer Christianity for the challenges of authentic discipleship. Modern churches had trained people to be religious consumers rather than committed community members. But those who are willing to pay this cost, Jesus continued, are discovering the joy, purpose, and transformation that I always intended my church to provide. They're learning what it means to be my body in the world rather than just my audience on Sunday. As the vision progressed, I could see how Jesus was using these small, authentic communities to prepare for something much larger. They were learning lessons, developing leaders, and establishing patterns that would be essential for the future of Christianity. These communities, Jesus explained, are not the end goal, they're the beginning of something much greater. They're learning to be the church I originally designed, and they're preparing for the work I'm calling my people to do in the days ahead. The implications were both exciting and sobering. Jesus wasn't trying to reform existing religious institutions, he was building something entirely new through believers who were willing to abandon the comfort of consumer Christianity for the challenge of authentic discipleship. But Lord, I asked, my heart racing as I considered what this meant for the millions of believers in traditional churches. What about all the sincere Christians who are part of modern church institutions? Are you calling them to abandon everything they've built? I'm not calling them to abandon buildings or programs, Jesus replied, his expression mixing infinite compassion with holy determination. I'm calling them to abandon the mindset that has turned my church into a religious business and my people into spiritual consumers. The vision shifted to show me believers within traditional churches who were beginning to pursue authentic community and radical discipleship despite the institutional structures around them. They were forming deeper relationships, practicing mutual accountability, and living with the kind of sacrificial love that transformed both themselves and their communities. The question, Jesus continued, is not whether someone attends a megachurch or a house church, it's whether they're willing to be part of authentic Christian community that demands everything and transforms everything. As the vision began to fade and the Santos living room gradually reappeared around us, Jesus rose from the center of the circle and came to sit beside me, his eyes filled with both divine hope and holy expectation. Jonathan, he said, I'm building my church through believers who are willing to abandon religious comfort for spiritual transformation. The question is whether my people will join what I'm building or continue trying to reform what I never intended. The church I'm building, he continued, will look very different from what has been constructed in my name. It will be smaller but stronger, less impressive but more transformational, less comfortable but more authentic. As his presence began to intensify rather than fade, I realized this wasn't just information he was sharing, it was an invitation he was extending to every believer willing to abandon consumer Christianity for authentic discipleship. Right now, Jesus said, any believer can choose to be part of what I'm building rather than what humans have constructed. They can stop being religious consumers and start being authentic community members. In that moment, sitting in the same chair where I had first experienced genuine Christian community, I felt the weight of years of religious activity lifting from my heart. The stunning truth wasn't just about what was wrong with modern churches, it was about what Jesus was actively building through believers willing to return to his original design. The question, Jesus said as his presence filled the living room with transforming light, is not whether you're impressed by what humans have built in my name, it's whether you're willing to be part of what I'm building through surrendered hearts. As his presence finally began to fade, his final words burned themselves into my consciousness. Tell them that I'm not trying to reform religious institutions, I'm building authentic spiritual communities. Tell them that the church I'm building will cost them everything but give them everything. Tell them that the choice is not between different types of churches, but between religious consumption and spiritual transformation. For months now, this stunning truth has revolutionized my understanding of what God is doing in contemporary Christianity. Jesus is not impressed by the success of modern churches because their success has come at the cost of abandoning his original design for authentic spiritual community. But the most stunning revelation is that he hasn't given up on his church. He's building it through believers who are willing to abandon the comfort of religious consumption for the challenge of authentic discipleship. These communities are small and often overlooked, but they're learning to be what the church was always meant to be. The stunning truth about what Jesus thinks of modern churches is not just a critique of what's wrong, it's an invitation to be part of what he's building. And that invitation is available to any believer willing to exchange religious comfort for spiritual transformation, consumer Christianity for authentic community, and impressive institutions for genuine discipleship. The church Jesus is building will look very different from what has been constructed in his name, but it will be what he always intended: communities of radically transformed people demonstrating his kingdom through their love for each other and their service to the world.